Okay, everybody, today we're going to work on value mixing. So this is my little skull. This is a deer skull that was I've had for over 25 years. My friend was skateboarding in Reading, PA, and he found it in the woods. I thought for a long time that it was a sheep skull because I didn't know that much about skulls. And then I did a little more research, and it actually is a deer skull. It just when it was out in the woods, the longer nose piece deteriorated. So it looks like it could potentially be from a smaller animal. As I was setting up my still life, I'll tell you that a few things I think about is how I want this to sit. And because this has a large curve on it, it sits like this when I try to look at it. One of the reasons I use the fabric is so that I can balance it at an angle that works for me. I also don't really enjoy just painting a flat white surface or a flat surface under what I'm looking at, because I find it harder to paint expanses of black or blank area. I brought a few pieces of fabric in. You see this one is more of a nondescript coffee color. And then this is like a corduroy. I go to thrift stores and look for fabric. And over the years, I have kind of a collection of what I like to work at. And one of the things I was thinking about is contrast and which background I might like to use. Either one of these I think would have worked. This coffee color would be kind of interesting, but I sort of decided I would like the darker contrast of the corduroy. And when painting the fabric of the corduroy, I don't know if I'll do this today, but this contouring of the stripes can actually kind of help when I'm looking at the fabric to create the form and the bumps of it. So it is an attraction to this fabric, is kind of experimenting with that. Now that I talked about it, it's more likely that I'll do this. So I'm putting this off in the distance a little bit, setting it up so it's at an angle. I like the 3/4 view for this. If you think about portraits of people, 3/4 view versus a full face, 3/4, versus if we looked at this straight on. I find 3/4 perspective just a little bit easier to manage. Some days when I want a real challenge, I try to do the foreshortening like this. We're not going there today. So, and I did pick this object because it's a great study for contrast, and value is really about contrast, looking for where the darks are versus where the light's reflecting back and appearing lighter. You all don't have to access dead things and skulls to be part of this class. That just happens to be what I'm attracted to. And I don't know, I think when I make imagery of things that I like, that it makes me teach more interesting lessons. So I try to bounce back and forth a little bit. I also like to paint things that are organic or occurring in nature, versus manufactured objects. Not that I don't like to paint a coffee cup here and there, but we'll talk more about that as weeks go by. So this is my palette paper. This is from a Stay Wet palette kit. It has a little bit of not wax, but it's not very absorbent. If you might have like the waxy palette paper, that's great. Or if all you have at home is wax paper like you use for baking, that can work too. So we're going to start with my normal go-to colors to create a charcoal black, ultramarine and blue umber, My words are fumbly today. Time for me to wake up. Ultramarine blue and burnt umber. You can make a dark color with, for example, cerulean blue and burnt umber, or phthalo blue and burnt umber, or a brown like burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. It's not like these are the only two you can use, but when we start color mixing, these are the two that are the most forgiving for color mixing. And that's why I try to have you buy these and we kind of start from this direction. If you have other paints than golden, Liquitex or some brands that maybe don't use as strong of pigments, even Blick or Utrecht acrylic paint is weaker in pigment. The ultramarine blue, the burnt umber, and the titanium white are actually pretty good. So if you're trying to find ways to save money when you're buying paint, like these three pigments are more common and you can kind of cut corners with them a little bit more. I like this brand. I like the consistency of it, but I'm more inclined to use, for example, a Liquitex pigmented color of these three than I would of a cadmium yellow or a cadmium red. Every week I will like spout out things like this to you, and some of it'll stick in your mind and some of it you'll let go. You don't have to have that all memorized. It's just for those of you that are curious. So we're also going to use titanium white today, whereas last week we only did an underpainting with these two colors, the blue and brown. So over here in one corner, I'm going to make my dark mixture. I usually try to mix equal amounts. If you're painting with oil paint, this is exactly the same exercise, except instead of water, which is a solvent, water is a solvent for acrylic, you'll use terpenoid or Gamsol as your solvent. No water for the oil painting. Got my trusty palette knife. This is what happens if you don't clean them off enough, but that's really dried on there. If this mixture leans a little more blue or a little more brown, that is a non-issue. You don't need to worry about that. Or if you use up this paint, you have to mix another batch of it. Also, it doesn't matter if these values match exactly in the blue or brown range. The only significance here is having strong dark value. This is very dark and this is going to work very well for what I need today. So cleaning off my knife. And then if one really great thing to try to have, not for oil painting, you don't need this. The beauty of oil paints is that they don't dry up as fast on you. But for acrylic painting, this is like a little watercolor spray bottle that I spritz my palette with so that my paint doesn't dry up on me. If you have a plant mister and you don't want to have to go buy an additional spray bottle, plant misters work great. So here's titanium white. Now, in the center, I start by trying to take equal amounts of paint. And this is a good point, whether you're painting with acrylic or oil. I'll just straighten that out. That's a habit that I like to work on a diagonal. Try to take equal amounts and try to get in the habit of cleaning your palette knife off between going back and forth. When you're mixing grays, it might not seem like such a big deal, but later on when we start mixing color, it's helpful to have the outer sides be more pure in pigment. So we're looking for a middle gray here in the center. And I'll tell you that as a rule of thumb, I knew this was going to be a day of puns. I usually go for 5 steps in between. So it ends up being 7 values, 1 dark here, 1 very light here, and 5 steps of gray in between. Some of us on the very first try are value experts. Or I see this and it's very easy for us. I say that loosely because I don't think that I'm actually all that great at value. I've just been doing this for a long time, so I'm a little better at it than I used to be. One thing to know is do not despair if you think that you don't have a strong gauge on value at the other end of this exercise, because painters all over the place, all over the world, we have different skill sets and things that we are become good at over time. And so if you're not strong in perspective or you're not strong in value, you might have a really great sense of color, and that may hold your painting practice together. So these exercises are just to kind of try and be kind to yourself, because it could be new or challenging, but you don't have to be perfect. So you can see that this gray is in between. Now, I'm going to put it right there on the range, and then just cleaned my palette knife off. I have some white right here. I'm scooping from this pile. It doesn't matter if you take from over here, just go back and forth and try to get a gradation. I may have put too much gray on here. And so what you'll see is that I'm pretty much mixed 2 of the same value. So we'll just make this pile bigger. And now there's a little bit of that left right here. Let's add some of my white to it. So I'm looking at this with my eye in real life. I'm also double checking on the computer screen to see what appearance you get over Zoom. I mean, I can see the difference between these two. I can see a slightly larger leap here and a larger leap here. This gradation works. It's totally usable. Maybe I could make this slightly darker. So I'm just taking a little bit of that middle gray and adding it. All right. The point of this exercise is not to make you perfectionists. It's a real life example of you, of understand for you of understanding how value works. And that doesn't always come to each person intuitively. Even if you're good at value, it can be kind of fun just to do this. I was excited to teach this exercise today because for me, it's like my favorite pair of pants. I'm like, oh, I can't go wrong when I wear these. And I probably taught this exercise almost more than anything else except underpainting. And there's something very relaxing for me about it. So I want to see a difference, but they can be close. And now for this next step between here and here, I'm going to pull from this pile again. I'm going to try to add a little bit of white to it. So I can see these are still very close. Just pull a little more white. I'm starting to be able to see the difference between this outer value and here, but there's still a very big jump right here. I could probably easily paint this skull without those being closer, but you know, it's good to stretch my brain muscles a little bit and be like, oh, can I add a little more white to that and get it to go a little more in between? When you mix your colors before you paint, what it allows you to do is relax more into your painting process because you have this all set up for yourself. So you don't have to focus so much on creating the color. It's already there for you. As I line this up, now I see there's kind of a bigger jump here, and these two are kind of close, even though I can see the difference. Instead of making this darker, I think I'm going to make that step slightly lighter. I put a lot of paint on there. I'm like, why not add a little bit less to start? We're just trying to bump it a smidge. I'm going to add a little bit more. I probably could have gotten away with what I had tried. This is a fairly big pile of paint, so the more paint that's there, the more you have to add to change the value. Also, sometimes, you know, I just need to mix it longer and it starts to settle down. So just a little bit more. Now, this is pretty messy and I could totally just paint. You know, I think I give people the impression that I'm a very neat and tidy painter. I'm a neater and tidier teacher because I think it makes it easier for you all. I'm a mess as a painter. This is good. This is a Zoom classroom so that you can't see what a disaster is going on behind you or me. And that's okay, because sometimes, you know, making a painting is better than focusing on housekeeping. And if you can't do both, well, you got to make some choices. But don't think after 4 weeks, if you walk away from this class and this looks like, you know, literally a hot mess when you try to do it, that it's because you're doing it wrong. For me, as somebody because the profession of trying to help people learn how to paint or be artists, I just want you to paint. So if organizing things in this way is getting in the way of your ability to just sit down and make stuff, then don't do it anymore. My only hope is that me showing you in this organized way helps make sense of something that might be a little more confusing if I just like explained it with words without showing you. So this is a value range from black to white. I'm once again looking for my spritz bottle. My studio is cold today, so I have a space heater going and it's going to make my paint dry up a little faster. So now I'm going to put this off to the side. Pulling my water over here. All I need to start is my dark. I could pull this together with a gray, like this undercolor. Actually, maybe just out of curiosity. We'll start with that middle gray tone. I want to get as much of this painting surface in. And I don't want to give you all motion sickness by trying to move my camera around too much. This is not a huge piece of paper for me. I didn't measure it, but it looks like it might be 11 inches by 16 inches. It's great for an object the size of this deer skull, which I might paint a little bit larger than life. And then this brush is a white Taklon flat, #1. The brand is Connoisseur. It's been well used, but when I make it wet, this will sharpen up a little bit. And I'm going to take quite a bit of water here. And this is my middle gray. It's right in the center. I'm making it fairly watery. If I was painting with oil, I would be adding a lot of terp and making it very flexible. I don't want it too chunky. I want to be able to pull away with a cloth if I don't like the lines I make. I don't want it to be completely transparent like watercolor either. So you can see as I pull that across, it's flexible, but it's not like watercolor. And let's just, for me, I'm going to start with a contour line. I'm going to try to make the skull larger than life without it actually falling off the paper too much. It's okay if I break the boundary of the paper here and there, but I want the bulk of it to be on here. And if you're happening to look at the photograph that I had pasted into the chat earlier, the perspective that I see with my eye is not exactly the same as the photo. So there's some differences that I'm copying. Also, my proportions are never perfect, and I don't think it matters that much. This is my time and place and my way that sorry, I got distracted by the chat. This is my time and place in my interpretation of something that I'm looking at in life. And so I try to make the response to the objects I pick sort of a meditation. It kind of, my hope is for me that it creates like a quiet stillness. I also find still life can be, I'm don't know, I think still life is underappreciated in the art world these days. People think of it as a college exercise, but we have so much movement and so much information coming at us that just taking a little bit of time, no worries, Jennifer, taking a little bit of time and observing. I think this exercise of art making and what I have noticed with a lot of my students is that maybe it's not just easy enough to sit down and try to make yourself stop and like do the spiritual or the aspirational practice of meditation, but like drawing or painting or creative making can be sort of a segue into connecting with quieter parts of yourself. And I think that's often why we're attracted to it, because we want an opportunity to do something or describe something that doesn't necessarily have a reason or a purpose. It's just for the sake of kind of showing up and being interested. Trying not to put my paintbrush into my tea water. That's always the biggest hurdle for me, especially when I'm teaching online. Notice, I'm kind of working in a contour line, but I'm also letting myself sort of make shorter, more sensitive marks. This just happens depending what mood I'm in. Sometimes I just come in and I need to get it out and I paint more gesturally. In other days, I'm way more in a place of like a quiet, more sensitive contemplation. And one of those is not better than the other. What I want to have here is enough information to fill in my values then. This exercise isn't about making a finished painting, it's about creating a value study. If all you did for the next year were studies, that, I don't know. For me, I've been painting for a long time, and I still just call them all studies because I feel like it gives me permission to not think it has to be more than that. And then sometimes these studies get framed and they get sold in an exhibit, or somebody sees it online and they want it. And that's good too, because it helps me, pay for my studio, buy more supplies. But for me, I feel like I'm just still very much in the place of learning. And if I appreciate being able to share that learning process with all of you. I listen to these sometimes and I'm like, wow, like I said that, I'm like, feel kind of smart. And other times I'm like, this is so incredibly boring. I don't know how anybody can handle it. So all I can figure out is if you're coming back, that it must be helpful to you in some way. And I'm glad for that. So just looking at some of the little pock marks. Now, there is kind of all this, I can kind of pull back and look and say, yes, this works. Maybe this line could be a little thinner. Right here, I might have given that a little too much fullness. So I just happen to have sort of like this old terry cloth rag, and I dipped it into some water. If I was painting with oil, I would dip it into turpenoid, and that would be my solvent. And then what I was hoping is that, yeah, I can erase out on that line. Did I really need to do that? And would have I done that if you weren't all watching me? Probably I would have just covered it up with some paint. But I like to remind you that you can backtrack on things with that method. And even now to me, I'm like, I don't know if I even need a line there right now. There we go. That feels better. I do want to quickly address some of the fabric. Although I don't, excuse me, I'm losing my voice a little bit. It's what happens when you talk nonstop for 45 minutes. So now I'm jumping around on my palette. And for the fabric, I'm going to use some of this darker value for the lines. Notice I'm adding a lot of solvent to it again. And so probably if you happen to be looking at the photo, I probably moved the fabric around some since the photo so that it's not going to be like a perfect rendition. But I think you'll get the idea. And so I'm looking at the way the corduroy laps, and I'm kind of following that. I really bought this piece of corduroy because I like the color of teal. But now I'm recognizing how kind of helpful it is to sort of create that perspective of the fabric moving back and forth. So let's see, as I'm doing this, now I'm looking, this will be very dark in value here, and I can start talking about that with my underpainting. You know, I can start deepening that value. You can see with your eye. Sometimes I squint because squinting at what I'm looking at helps me to see the value better. But you can kind of see with your eye as you look at my picture that even that sort of gray, more density right here made the value darker. But also I am still using line a little bit so I can see some folds of fabric across here. And right here in the corner is actually my tabletop. I'm not going to paint that in right now. It's just this kind of nondescript wood color. And I'll decide later how much I want to say about that. So I'm coming back and following my stripes. I did not get the perspective on these stripes perfectly. And it doesn't matter because I don't know, to my eye, they look kind of interesting. So I'm not going to fix what's not appearing broken on my painting. I'm also, I don't know, in some ways you could say I'm a perfectionist or detail oriented, but in other ways, I'm just trying to have an interesting experience. And if I realize my perspective's a little off, I'm just often like, well, it is what it is. Maybe I'll get it better next time. Because I don't want to get so bogged down in that I stop my painting and keep trying to fix it. I'll learn more, I think, about painting by just making this painting, forgiving what's not perfect in it, and making a note maybe to try it differently next time. With that said, I have had students that I've worked with for long periods of time. Also, before I move on to that, pulling this a little darker right here, there's a shadow underneath those teeth, and it's also darker in here. I've had students that I worked with for long periods of time and that have really struggled with perspective. And what I recommend is taking a drawing class, because working out some of those bugs around perspective can actually be easier through the process of drawing with a pencil and eraser. And it's good to work with lots of different instructors. Each artist that instructs art comes to this with a different framework and from a different place. They might tell you different things than I do. They might say what I told you is wrong, and that's okay, because that's just their perspective. Not drawing perspective, living life perspective. So there's a dark triangle up here. I'm going to speed up the striping so that I can actually start on the value, which means it's going to get a little sloppier, and I think that might be good for the actual painting anyway. This is darker. I've added some water, and that's pretty washy as it goes in there. And I just want to get this fold of fabric as it comes back across here. It's kind of stripy. Then it cuts into shadow. Now, oh, it's only 10:46. I'm doing great. But I would say if you want to check in, leave me a note in the chat. And I think at about 10 minutes after 11, I can check in with people. But last week was really quiet and a lot of people didn't want to check in. And you know what? That's no problem. So if you want to check in, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just keep painting. And I have plenty of values to fill in on here. So there's just a lot to paint. So if you don't need to check in, that's great. Or if you'd rather send me an email or post on Discord of what you're working on, that can be really helpful. Sometimes, for example, if you're somebody that's working from a still life and you're struggling with your perspective, if you send me your photo reference in an email or on Discord, what's nice about that is I can use markup to show you what small adjustments you might be able to make. It's been kind of a great tool for me during the pandemic as a teacher, where we're not always meeting, or we're generally not meeting in person. So I'm also going to take my darker value with water and pull that across here. Now, at this point, that might feel kind of a little busy. So I'm taking this brush, I'm just putting it off to the side for a minute. And then this is just a fat little craft brush. And one thing to note about these, a craft brush, it says 1. Well, you're like, well, this is a size 1 and this is a size 1. What's happening here? This one says 1 inch. So it's kind of like clothing. The sizing doesn't always make sense from brand to brand or types of brush. This is a watercolor brush. It's not intended for acrylic or oil, but I could use it with acrylic. If I used it with oil, it would forever be an oil brush. I would never use it in acrylic again. But I kind of keep it with my acrylics and watercolor stuff so that I have it available. But I like it because it's kind of fat. So I'm taking my darkest value and adding water to it, like a wash. And before I start painting into the skull, oh, I'm gonna lose all my stripes. Let's see if some of these on the other side are a little darker or drier, not darker. They are. So this wash is pretty transparent, but it is knocking down that value. And now that the acrylic paint is dark enough, it's not pulling my stripes up either. If I was painting in oil, I'd know that I'd lose those if I did that wash over top. So I might wait. And often when I paint in oil, I do multiple paintings so that I can make choices about waiting for certain areas. You know, I might get to this point with my underpainting in oil and jump to a new underpainting so that I can be, so I can let my mark solidify a little more. I just wanted to push the value towards a grayscale, and this skull being the lighter thing that I'm looking at, I think it sort of settles some of the busyness down of those lines. And in some ways, as the wash is kind of pulling back on them, it's also giving it the feeling more of fabric. I'm not being very exacting in this, you know. I kind of trust that the line work and the story I told with that is enough to hold this together. And the way it's pulling up here, that kind of works for me. I like those, as Bob Ross would say, happy accidents. One thing so then I do a little like look it over, because my next step is to really try to get into the skull and describe these values with more detail. I will leave this background pretty loose for at this point. I might never do another thing to it and focus all my energy on the focal description of the skull. But the one thing I'm seeing that I want to do before I move on to that is just inside this eye. I think it helps to describe that darker value there. This piece right here is actually an interior bone, and I'm going to wait, instead of doing a transparent wash on that part, actually use a more solid color. So as I come in on this value, sorry, I'm making my table shake while I'm cleaning out my brush. This little dark spot right here, kind of wiping that out, pulling these a little bit too. Maybe pulling across there slightly. Okay. So I'm looking at my palette, trying to think about how this palette can be in your viewpoint while I'm painting the value. It probably means I'm going to pull my camera up a little bit. It has a little hand crank on it. If you're got motion sickness, just don't look. Okay. We're going to try these adjustments. Okay. Not perfect, but you're all going to get the idea. There's my scale. I'm going to start out by jumping back in with the smaller brush. I may get impatient with that over time and decide to move on to a bigger one, but I don't know. I'm kind of in a particular mood today. The first thing that I want to do when I look at the skull, and I don't always do this is a common question that I get from students, is do you go dark to light or light to dark or start in the middle value? And what I want to say about that is that I do it differently every time, and I don't have a hard and fast rule. Often, I think it's easier for me to start with the dark value and build to light. And that is what I'm going to do today. I'd say if you're really feeling insecure and you're not sure which way to go, then start dark, but you don't have to do that. I'm also mixing this with a little bit of water that was already laying on the palette, but the paint is thicker than anything I've been using. And then I'm just coming mostly from up down because I don't want to drag my hand through paint, which is a common thing. Sooner or later, I'm going to do it today, but I'm more worried about messing up my painting necessarily than getting paint on my hand. So just starting and squinting at my object I'm looking at and looking for the very darkest, which is in the interior here, descriptions. It's very tunnely in there with little bone fragments. And I can give the impression of areas without having to describe everything perfectly. So I'm sort of jumping around a bit and almost sort of popping in those dark negative spaces and not so much worrying about where it's gray at this point. A little bit of squinting because I'm like, okay, there's a bone structure right here. And then it's pretty dark in the interior down here. If I realize I make a mark in the wrong spot, I can know with acrylic paint, especially with a space heater going, that this is going to be dry in a few minutes. So also this bone piece on the interior here is quite dark. It's not quite as dark as the value I just painted there, but it's pretty darn dark. So one thing about those middle gray values is that they're pretty close to the background that I'm painting. So that's not necessarily what I want to be my focus. I have just dropped down to the next value down, which looks almost black. And I'm coming across. And I'm starting to paint a little more gesturally right now. Because sometimes I get one, bored with myself when I get a little too fussy, but two, I'm trying to think about the classroom and the exercise. squinting. So right here, I painted this really dark. I'm dropping to the next value step because to my eye, this could start being a little lighter. And as I put that on there, I'm like, nope, I think I can go to this middle gray over this black. This is called wet on wet. And start describing some of these interior spots with this middle gray. Now I get that desperate feeling a little bit in my chest when I'm doing this because I'm like, now I can't see the skull versus the background. But I also know that my next move is going to be to pull in my lighter whites. So that it's going to be okay. I just have to be trusting and patient with my process. I'm dry brushing now. I'm just taking what's left on my brush and dragging it across these primarily white, high value surfaces. Before I start painting my lightest values across here, in this interior, I definitely want that to push darker. And it's a little tricky. There's a lot to say in there so that it could be like a difficult space to kind of describe. But what I'm going to do, I think, is a dark wash. So I'm adding water to this and just knocking the white highlights down. As I want that to push back. And if it gets too dark or too nondescript, I can add more in on top. Now, I'll let that dry. And I'm looking at my skull and I'm needing to decide what value to start using for these higher, lighter colors. And this is the thing about value studies is that you might be looking at something that's not the same color. This is, pretty monochromatic subject. Maybe we could say it's this gray, or on the highlights, it's this white. It's also probably in between. So I'll be using my brush and mixing some paint in between for it too. And now I'm coming through and looking to hit my lightest areas. And I can already, like this very lightest up here, adding white right out of the tube on top of some of those grays. If I paint myself into a corner with this, my first inclination will be to do an underpainting back over top with a dark line. I'm not sure that's going to be necessary because as I put this lighter value in, I'm feeling a little more grounded. And I feel like it's starting to look more like bone. I cleaned out my brush just because a lot of gray paint was getting picked up. And I'm really going over a lot towards this white to try to get that bone to show up against what's in the background. I see like a really strong light right across here, and these eyepieces are pretty important. And sort of looking right through here and feeling like that could go a little lighter. There's more light hitting it than I had indicated. There's also, while these areas go very dark, there's in between areas that are popping quite light. And then just quickly pulling some lights across here. Now, for where I am in the process, I'm not unhappy with how the skull's turning out. All that noise in the background is kind of a lot for my brain. So as these areas that I just addressed are kind of drying, I'm going to come back to my fat brush, and I'm going to do another layer of a wash across the background. And I'm dropping down a little bit, not quite as black, and just cutting in here. If some of these stripes show through, that's great. But if I lose them, so be it, because the focal point of my painting is more the skull. I wasn't sure when I first started how much contrast there needed to be from the skull to the background, but as I'm painting, I think it's helping to push those values back. And one thing that I do, or I'm starting to do as I'm talking to you, is look for the shape and use those marks I'm putting on the background to kind of cut around. And it's called reduction, when you use another color to reduce what you already painted. I'm being very painterly in my mark making. It's lots of layers of gestural paint. So this line right here, this is an example of using the reduction. Something is a little too full across here for how I'm seeing my skull. So then I can kind of observe and try to imitate. You know, sometimes I hold my brush up against the skull and I close one eye, and I use that to cut around and try to imitate how that line comes through in the background. And if I don't get it the first time, I know I can always paint in another description or a line and try again. Now, right in here, I could take a minute with a dark value and really try to describe that nose a little better. And I think that'll help settle the painting down too. So now I'm coming into my very darkest value, the wet mixture. And once again, doing that kind of squinting thing, closing one eye, looking at how this point comes down through here. I'll try to come in with my left hand so you can see a little better. It's not my strongest hand, but I've been trying to teach myself to paint left-handed because I actually have more problems with a tremor in my right arm, which was what happens when you use your body to do something one way over and over again as you get older. It sometimes doesn't want to keep cooperating. So this is my new practice, is trying to learn how to do it left-handed too. Now, I could kind of leave that there like a shadow line with this pushing white. I think for the moment I might not decide to leave it that way. We'll see. So, and then it becomes an evaluation of, I think that I want to gray this out a little bit. I like there being movement there. I'm just trying to knock down these outer values without just painting them into one thick solid blanket. I keep adding more and more layers to try to push them back. We're at 11:12, so if anybody wants to check in, let me know in the chat. But otherwise, I'll keep painting until I see something pop up, and then at 11:30, we're going to close class. And also, I'll eventually, sometime this week, post this to Discord in case you want to rewatch it, or just go back to one part that you were like, oh, I need to see that again. Now I'm coming in with some dark values and sharpening up. Also, this is a good time to talk about this. I probably don't mention it enough. When my painting starts getting away from me, which sooner or later happens, sometimes my inclination is just to come back and redraw as though I'm doing the underpainting right back over top as I try to ground. So it's not, I make an underpainting, that's done, now I only fill in colors. It's kind of a dance back and forth. I also come to painting as somebody that learned to draw first, and I have fairly strong drawing skills. So sometimes for me, like what I create or how I adjust my underpainting, what makes my paintings work as a painter is having a fairly strong ability to draw. And so I lean on that, and where I might not be as good at always describing the perfect value, then I lean on my drawing skills to try to pull it back together. Which is what I'm doing right now. Oh, and see right here, I wanted to put a black line, but I've pulled up too much paint from the painting because it's still fairly wet. So I'm cleaning out my brush. I'm drying it off on a rag. If if you're painting with oil, you should know that if I was painting with oil, I almost always have a rag in my left hand or cloth that I constantly am pulling the oil paint off my brush as I dip back into my palette. It's almost just become a habit, and it helps my paint not to get as muddy. So I think that's worth pointing out. I do it a little bit with acrylic, but oil's just more sticky. It doesn't dry, and it doesn't necessarily come off your brush as easy with the solvent. So I think it's worth talking about. This painting will not be finished today. That probably means it may just sit out there in the ether, never finished. Sometimes I like how things are kind of half done. So I'm saying to myself, well, what do I have to do here before I walk away for the day? This value could go darker. Maybe over here in the grays, this could be a little fuller. I didn't put as much paint on these areas. You can kind of see some of the gesso of the paper showing through here. And as I'm painting, my white is getting, some of the gray is getting pulled up. So now I'm cleaning out my brush again. Something a little weird going on over here. Just pulling into this gray. This line needs to be softened in between. It's got like a slow gradation. And let this dry. It's gotten very muddy. Now I'm coming in with my dark kind of grays, looking at my background again, pulling some thicker paint in here, but not everywhere. Doesn't need, some of these areas can be a little thinner. It's okay if I lost my stripes. This once again, this what I'm doing with my brush now is pretty painterly. I find as I'm looking at this line right here to be kind of distracting. So knocking that back a bit. Whereas these lines in the foreground have more of a fondness for. And so let's do this. Another layer of wash. I think what I'm doing is kind of looking at my line work across here for the fabric. And so I see this line that comes across here, and then I've moved my image, or object, my still life. I see now that this line is more of a diagonal. And so compositionally, I think it works out better if I describe it a little more like that. Still feels a little strong. Now I'm like, well, what if I too light in that value? Taking a cloth, pulling that back off. And this is interesting. The paint is just tacky and white enough that I can kind of still pull some of it back up and some of it's sticking. So it creates an interesting, weird texture. Maybe not the texture of exactly what I'm looking at, but sort of like it. So working those surfaces. Now, squinting seems to be a major pastime. I'm back to my thin little brush. I'm still playing around with this line over here. And I know from making these skull paintings that I can come back to this like 5 times. I might only do 5 minutes of painting on it as I try to make those adjustments to get it to land. But it just ends up being like a lot of back and forth. This one's working pretty well. One thing I'm noticing is that maybe this is a little full here, and this could have been a little thicker. So just try that. I didn't really get an opportunity to play with the teeth very much. And let's add that. Proportions as you put your layers on can kind of get adjusted. So one of the things I'm seeing is that this eye could be a lot fuller. And this line comes up like this. It's a little cleaner. This bone. Probably better to have a stronger white line across here. And I think I'll need to do some adjustments there if I come back to this. But for now, I'm going to call that done. Say it was an interesting reflection on this little deer skull, which I hopefully called a deer skull the whole time and not a sheep skull. I just have a couple more minutes before I have to run to any other class. I teach another one this afternoon in person. So feel free to say hi if you want to. But mostly just saying have a good day and thanks for showing up. Thanks, Bing.
Thanks, Jolene. That was
Thank
really
you.
nice.